Sarah lived in a small coastal town where heavy storms were a frequent occurrence. Sometimes it was calm and quiet outside, but sometimes the wind was so strong that it seemed like it was about to tear the roof off the house. On such days, the townspeople preferred to stay in their homes rather than go outside. Moreover, Sarah always liked solitude. After a long day's work, it was pleasant to sit in a chair with a book or a cup of hot tea, listening to the sound of rain outside the window. One night, when a real hurricane was raging outside the window, Sarah felt the wind begin to increase. At first there was a scraping sound, like something metal hitting the glass. Suddenly the lights in the house went out. At first she thought it was a normal system failure, since the power often went out in this kind of weather. But at that moment, something inside her told her that this was not going to be an ordinary night. Without waiting for the power to be restored, Sarah got up and went to the closet to get the candles. She was lighting the way with the flame when she noticed that the house had gotten too quiet. Even the sounds of the storm outside the window had somehow become hushed, and the wind itself was no longer audible. This sense of silence was so thick that it was as if the atmosphere itself had swallowed up all sound. After placing the candles on the table and settling into a chair, Sarah decided to rest for a while. A few minutes later, however, she was disturbed by a strange knock on the door. It wasn't a hard knock, but rather a light, barely audible knock, as if someone was tapping gently on wood with a finger. Sarah squinted and got up from her chair, deciding to check to see who might be at the door on a night like this. Could it be a neighbor who hadn't dealt with the blackout either? When she got to the door, it was completely dark outside. She cautiously peeked through the window, but saw no one. This surprised her even more, since she had definitely heard knocking. She opened the door, but saw no one. Everything was as quiet and empty as it had been a few minutes before. A feeling of strange uneasiness did not leave her. She closed the door and went back into the room. But just as Sarah reached the chair, the knocking sounded again, now in the other corner of the house. Her heart raced. She froze in place, listening to the sounds, which were now growing louder. The knocking was precise and crisp, as if someone were walking through her house. She decided to check again to see who it was. This time she pulled out her cell phone to call the police if something went wrong. But as soon as she tried to call, the phone refused to work. It wouldn't turn on and the screen remained black. What the hell? She thought, panicking as she tried to reboot the device. However, the phone did not respond. With each new knock, her anxiety grew. Sarah went back to the door again and cautiously peered outside. Nothing. She closed the door and returned to her chair again. But this time the knocking didn't subside. It grew more and more distinct and got closer. Suddenly the silence in the house was broken by a new sound, heavy breathing, as if someone was standing nearby. Sarah turned around, but saw no one. A sense of the presence of something sinister hung in the air. She walked through the house, lighting her way with a candle, but found nothing unusual. When she entered the kitchen, she felt someone invisible watching her. In the corner, in the very darkness, stood a huge shadow that suddenly disappeared when Sarah looked at it. Now she knew for sure that something was wrong here. Sarah went back into the bedroom and closed all the windows, pulling back the curtains. But the strange feeling was with her the whole time. The lights going out, the strange sounds, the disappearing shadows, all made her feel vulnerable. When she tried to use her phone again, it suddenly came to life. On the screen, she saw a message from her roommate, whom she hadn't spoken to in days. The message had one word: help. Before she could even reply, the message disappeared. With trembling hands, Sarah started to check the home network. She noticed that the Wi-Fi was down too, and once again everything was silent. At that moment, she heard a rustle outside the door. Someone was slowly and cautiously approaching her room. She was in a panic, but because of the dark screen of her phone, she couldn't make out exactly who it was. When the light returned a few seconds later, Sarah instantly looked around. But nothing had changed. She heard someone say her name softly. She looked around again. Through the window she saw a silhouette standing in the street, but as she got closer, the shadow disappeared. Sarah began to climb the stairs, feeling her heart quicken its rhythm more and more. She felt a cold hand that seemed to grab her shoulder. It was so real that she cried out and jumped backward. Later, as the lights in the house returned to normal, Sarah tried to figure out what had been happening to her on this strange and eerie evening. She decided to check the footage from the outdoor surveillance camera, but what she saw left her in complete shock. The footage from when she heard the banging and strange footsteps showed someone's shadow moving around her house, even though she was alone. Days passed and Sarah tried to forget the nightmare, but on nights she continued to hear rustles and knocks, as if an unseen entity was watching her. Even though she knew that no one could hurt her, the feeling that someone was always there never left her. A week later, Sarah learned that her housemate, whom she hadn't seen in a long time, had been found dead in the basement. A terrible accident that turned out to have happened at the very moment Sarah felt in danger. Here, in this house, her life would never be the same. One July evening, when the heat in the city was at its peak, Max, a young man of 24, was sitting at home, looking through old photos on his phone. A thunderstorm that had not heralded anything unusual was getting closer and closer, and the windows of his apartment began to dimly reflect the lightning flashes in the distance. Every now and then the thunder rolled and the rain drummed on the glass, creating a soothing sound. Max had always loved evenings like this, rainy and calm. He sat in his chair, staring at the screen of his phone, going through the pictures of an old album. Here he was with his friends, with his parents, with his first girlfriend, whom he had broken up with long ago. Everything looked like part of a quiet life, like cozy memories. Suddenly, before he knew it, his phone suddenly went out. He tried to turn it back on, but the screen remained black. Max squinted his eyes and shook his head, trying to figure out what had happened. He jumped up from his seat and walked over to the outlet to see if the network was working. Suddenly the lights went out all over the house. Max stepped into the hallway and tried to turn on the switch, but he didn't hear the characteristic click. The electricity was gone. He quickly went back to his room to get a flashlight, and at that moment he heard the rumble of thunder again, which sounded much louder than before. It looks like it's raining harder outside, Max thought, but some uneasiness settled imperceptibly in his chest. Darkness engulfed everything around him. He fumbled for a flashlight and turned it on. The beam of light illuminated the room, and in the same second Max felt the house become unusually quiet. Everything became somehow ominous and unreal. He turned back to the window, trying to at least partially make sense of what was happening. It was getting darker outside the window, and the rain was getting heavier, with lightning flashing more and more often and more brightly in the sky. But Max realized that the silence in the house was even more palpable than usual. Distant peals of thunder could be heard far away from the house, but their echoes seemed as if there was no real rain. The sensation made him wary. When the boy returned to the living room, he noticed that his phone was back on. The screen lit up, and Max saw that there was a signal on the screen, something strange, isolated from the rest of the world. He saw several messages. The first was from his mother, which said, "Are you home?" The second was from Artem's friend, "Are you crazy?" And the third message looked like a reminder from some number that hadn't been saved. "Don't open the window. Wait for the signal." Max immediately felt a chill run down his spine. He tried to call one of his friends, but the network was dead. He went to the tool cabinet to find the spare phone he always had in case of such situations. But when he opened the drawer, he saw that the phone was gone. The feeling of growing dread grew stronger and stronger. Max went back into the room and picked up the flashlight again. He illuminated the walls, floor and ceiling, but stopped suddenly when the light fell on one of the pictures on the wall. It was an old picture of his family that had hung there for years, but there was something wrong with it now. There was something strange about the image of his father standing next to him, a figure that didn't belong to them. It was blurred, as if the photograph had failed to catch it the moment it appeared. Max could hardly bring himself to look away. The noise of the lightning rolled again, and at that moment his flashlight went out. He tried to turn it on again, but it wouldn't work. Everything was swallowed up by the darkness. He felt the dark, heavy air around him grow denser, and his heart began to beat with frantic force. And then, when everything seemed finally lost, the lights in the apartment suddenly turned on. But not just any light, everything in the house returned to normal. He turned on his phone, and it worked immediately. Messages started coming in one after another. Max breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that it was finally over. But it wasn't. As soon as he went back to the window to look outside, he saw that there was absolute silence. Even the sound of the rain had disappeared. As he looked out the window, he noticed that in the distance, in the place where his neighbors should have been, there was only one empty spot where their house stood. Max shuddered and walked back into the room. His gaze fell on the walls, on which strange shadows had already begun to grow. The feeling that he was not alone became quite apparent. He noticed movement in the corner, and then heard a slight rustle, as if something was approaching. But it wasn't something physical, it was the darkness itself, which was becoming more and more intrusive. His fingers began to tremble, and he turned off the light, desperately trying to do something. But the darkness consumed everything. At that moment, the phone rang loudly. He picked it up, and a number he didn't know appeared on the screen. The same strange number from which there had been a message earlier. The screen suddenly flickered and a message appeared. Your footsteps have been recorded. You can no longer escape. Max quickly put the phone down, feeling that something terrible was happening to him. He couldn't believe it. Immediately afterward, the phone went off again. There was absolute silence all around, and the sky outside the window turned blood red. Max didn't know what to do. Everything around him was becoming unbearably strange. He tried to go outside, but the door to the entryway wouldn't open. He heard someone whispering behind the door. With each new sound his heart pounded faster, and he felt he was on the verge of losing his mind. But the door still didn't open. He tried turning on the flashlight again, and the light illuminated his face. At that moment, his phone vibrated again. A message appeared on the screen that made his blood freeze in his veins. Can you see us? Max no longer knew if it was a hallucination from fear or something else, but he knew for sure that nothing would ever be the same again. Michael was a young electrician known for his professionalism and reliability. One evening he received an urgent call to fix an electrical problem in an old apartment building on the outskirts of town. This building did not look modern. Its facade was covered with cracks, and the windows had long been in need of repair. But Michael paid no attention to the atmosphere, being used to working with old buildings like this. He walked into the dark foyer, where the lights flickered strangely. There was a musty odor in the air that was characteristic of old houses. Power failures were known to be frequent here, and Michael expected his job to be to do just that. The elevator works, but be careful, the elderly house manager, Mr. Jenkins, who looked tired and a little nervous, told him. The electricity here spikes a lot. Michael nodded, deciding to take the elevator to get to the right floor faster. He pressed the button for the 12th floor, the doors closed with a quiet creak, and the elevator started moving. Moving quietly upward, Michael thought it would be business as usual. He was checking his phone, scrolling through news feeds, when suddenly, around the 6th floor, the elevator jerked and stopped abruptly. In the blink of an eye, everything around him went completely dark. Michael didn't immediately realize what had happened. He tried to find the elevator call button, but couldn't make it out in the total darkness. Sighing, he pulled out his phone to call his client and let him know he was stuck. But to his surprise, there was no connection or internet. He tried several times to reboot the device, but nothing was happening. Moments seemed like hours. At that moment, Michael felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't know what to do. The elevator wasn't moving, the phone wasn't working, and the only thing left was to wait. He tried to calm down, but the tension was building with every second. Suddenly, after a couple minutes, the light returned. The elevator started moving again, and Michael felt the tension subside a little. He exhaled, relieved that it was just another glitch in the system. The elevator, swaying gently, stopped at the 12th floor. But when the doors opened, Michael immediately realized something was wrong. In front of him was not the usual floor with doors to apartments and corridor. Instead, he found himself in a cemetery illuminated by the dim light of the moon. Mist shrouded the ground, and the graves with their stone crosses looked so old it seemed like they had been here for centuries. Michael froze, unable to believe his eyes. His heart clenched with fear, and he stepped forward, trying to understand what was happening. His gaze fell on one of the graves, and he froze in horror. His own name was written on the stone cross, and next to it was a picture of his face, as if it was his final resting place. In panic, Michael stepped into the elevator again and tried to press all the buttons, hoping the elevator would return to a normal floor. But it didn't respond. The elevator remained stationary and the doors would not close. At that moment the darkness engulfed him again. He stood in total darkness, clenching his hands into fists, his breathing becoming fast and heavy. He tried to exert some control over the situation, but no attempt came to fruition. He was alone again in this nightmarish place, and then, when the darkness was at its peak, Michael heard a strange, barely audible sound, as if someone was quietly whispering his name. He turned around, but saw no one. The elevator still stood motionless, engulfed in darkness, and Michael, panic-stricken, continued to plead for help, but no one answered him. At that moment, Michael realized that no one would find him.